how I tricked my brain into doing hard things. You might not have any problems playing video games or browsing social media on your phone. You might go on to do these things for a couple of hours or even longer than that. But what about studying for an hour or working on your side project a little bit? Even though you know that studying, finishing your projects, or working on your side business are equally productive and will benefit you in the long run, you would still prefer to play video games or randomly scroll through social media. It's obvious and also not at the same time. Still, there are people who study or work on their side projects. This begs the question, can we make difficult things easy? One might wonder how. In this article, we are going to discuss how we can train our brains into doing hard things and, if there's any way, we can make complex things easy. The function of dopamine. The one thing that's very important for our discussion of this article is dopamine. It's a pleasure molecule. But its function is not as simple as it seems. Dopamine is what makes us desire things. It gives us the motivation to desire and do things. But it can be pretty powerful. To inquire about the intensity of dopamine, neuroscientists conducted an experiment on rats. The researchers implanted electrodes in the brains of rats. They stimulated the rats' reward systems in the brains whenever the rats pulled a lever. It was concluded that the rats developed such an intense craving that they kept pulling the lever for hours until they would drop from exhaustion. The rats would refuse to eat or even sleep. Then the researchers reversed the process and blocked the dopamine release from the brain's reward center. As a result, the rats became so lethargic that getting up to drink water was not worth the effort. You can see the similar effects dopamine has on the human brain and our daily lives. The brain develops priorities in large part on how much dopamine it's going to get. If an activity releases excessive dopamine, you won't be motivated to do it. But if it releases a modest amount of dopamine, only then you'll be motivated to keep doing it. Behaviors that release dopamine. So which behaviors release dopamine? In an activity where you anticipate there's a potential reward, the brain releases dopamine. But if you know there are no rewards with that behavior, your brain won't release it. For example, when you eat your comfort food, your brain releases dopamine because it anticipates that it'll make you feel good, even if it actually makes you feel worse. That's because the brain doesn't care if the high dopamine activity is damaging to you. It just wants to fill itself with it. An example of this would be drug addicts. Besides getting you high, cocaine and heroin release unnatural amounts of dopamine, making you crave it even more. Of course, it has been noted that almost everything releases some amount of dopamine, even something so simple as drinking water. The highest dopamine you get is when you get a reward randomly. Playing video games and scrolling through social media gives us a so-called dopamine hit. You might think that it's harmless, but you would be amazed to see how wrong you could be. Dopamine tolerance. Our bodies have a biological system called homeostasis. It means that our bodies like to keep internal physical and chemical conditions at a balanced level. Whenever an imbalance occurs, our bodies adapt to it. When your brain gets used to having high levels of dopamine, it becomes its new normal. Thus, you develop a dopamine tolerance. This can be a huge problem since things that don't give you much dopamine don't interest you. This is why you want to stick to more comfortable things, since they get you with an ample amount of dopamine, whereas working or studying gives you a lot less dopamine, tricking your brain into doing hard things. This begs the question, can you do anything to prevent this? Of course you can. You need to do a dopamine detox every week. For one whole day, you will try to have as little fun as possible. You won't be using technology, you won't listen to music, or eat junk food the entire day. Basically, it would help if you embrace boredom. However, you're allowed to go for a walk, reflect on your life goals, or write down any ideas you get. If you don't want to take such extreme measures and starve yourself of all the pleasures, you can perform a smaller dopamine detox. Pick one day of the week when you're going to refrain from one of your high dopamine behaviors completely. From playing video games to eating junk food, it can be anything. The importance of boredom. From now on, every single week for one whole day, you're going to avoid one activity that gives you high dopamine. You will feel slightly bored, but that's the whole point of this initiative. You want to let your dopamine receptors recover from the unnaturally high dopamine that's been flooding your brain. Boredom is going to propel you to do other things that day. Things that you normally put off, like studying or working on your assignment or on your side project, because they didn't release high dopamine. Now that you're bored, it's easier for you to do those. How to use high dopamine behaviors in your favor. Ideally, you should avoid high dopamine behaviors as much as possible. Instead, you need to connect more dopamine to the things that will actually benefit you. Your current high dopamine activities can serve as an incentive to pursue things that give long-time benefits. You can use your high dopamine activities as a reward for completing difficult work. First, do the low dopamine activities, and after finishing those chores, you can reward yourself with things that give you high dopamine. It's possible to make complicated things more manageable, but when you're getting so much dopamine all the time, you won't be as excited about working on something that doesn't release much of it. We are all, to some extent, dopamine addicts, and it helps us achieve our goals and improve ourselves. But it's up to you to decide where you want to get your dopamine from. Only by balancing your dopamine levels, you will be able to gain control over your life. Thank you for watching the video. Please like, share, and subscribe to get all the updates.